Throughout the history of psychology, self-knowledge has been exalted as one of the noblest achievements of the human mind. From Socrates to Freud, from Jung to Foucault, the idea of knowing oneself has been placed at the center of the quest for authenticity, freedom, and personal growth. But what few dare to say, and what Carl Gustav Jung knew deeply, is that this journey inward can hide a silent and devastating risk: excessive introspection. There is a point at which looking inward ceases to illuminate and begins to blind, a point where self-knowledge, which should liberate, instead traps, where the individual, in trying to understand themselves, ends up getting lost in their own complexity. Jung realized, after diving deeply into his unconscious, that the human soul is not just an inner landscape to be explored, but a living, unpredictable force capable of swallowing the ego in its attempt to control. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he recounts moments when he almost lost his sanity while confronting the archetypal images that emerged from the unconscious. He does not romanticize this dive. He warns. The unconscious is not a secret garden where one gathers flowers of wisdom, but a dense and dangerous forest where walking without a map can mean never finding the way out. And it is precisely here that the danger lies. When the individual, driven by an insatiable thirst to understand their essence, dives so deep that they lose contact with the outside world. They begin to live more in symbols than in relationships, more in concepts than in affections, more in analysis than in experience. They isolate themselves, but believe they are evolving. They feel superior, but do not realize they are merely inflated. And when they try to return to the world, they discover that they no longer know how to relate, because everything around them has begun to seem superficial in the face of the vastness of their own psyche. This video is a deep analysis of the breaking point between healthy introspection and destructive obsession with oneself, a boundary that Jung not only studied in his patients, but also experienced himself. Here, we will explore how the process of self-knowledge, when taken to the extreme, can become a sophisticated form of intellectual narcissism, how the attempt to integrate the shadow can turn into a cult of one's own abyss, and how the quest for authenticity can end up creating an artificial personality, disconnected from lived reality. This video is not an attack on self-knowledge. It is a call for balance. It is a direct and necessary warning for those who confuse self-discovery with self-absorption. Because, as Jung demonstrated with his own life, knowing oneself is not about mastering one's own soul, but learning to live with it, without trying to dissect it to the last layer. Sometimes, true maturity lies not in understanding everything about who we are, but in accepting that there are parts of us that must remain mysterious. Because life is not just consciousness. It also demands spontaneity, surrender, and connection. And those who know themselves too well may forget what it is like to truly live. To understand the dangers of extreme self-knowledge, it is necessary to follow Carl Gustav Jung's journey to the heart of his own psyche, a crossing that was not theoretical, but lived with an almost unbearable intensity. After his break with Sigmund Freud, Jung entered what he himself described as a period of confrontation with the unconscious, an experience that distanced him from the external world and plunged him into a deep, intense, and sometimes terrifying inner dive. During this period, Jung temporarily abandoned his clinical practice and dedicated himself to a type of radical self-analysis. He recorded dreams, visions, impulses, feelings, not to control them, but to understand them in their symbolic language. It was during this time that he wrote the Red Book, a kind of intimate chronicle of his inner journey, filled with archetypal images, dialogues with symbolic figures, and dramatic representations of what he called images of the unconscious. Few psychologists have gone as far in this process, and few have returned with their sanity intact. Jung describes how these experiences brought him to the brink of madness. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he recounts that he often did not know whether what he saw and heard was real or delusion. He began to realize that within himself there were multiple voices, internal characters that demanded to be heard and respected. And although many of these contents brought profound insights into human nature, there was a price to be paid, the constant risk of psychic disintegration. It was not just about interpreting symbols or understanding traumas. It was a direct confrontation with the primordial forces of the unconscious, with the archetypes that shape the human psyche. Jung realized that by awakening these forces, the individual risks being possessed by them. The persona begins to dissolve, the ego weakens, and the self, this totalizing instance of the psyche, can become so overwhelming that the subject loses the sense of individuality. This is what he called ego inflation. When a person, upon coming into contact with archetypal aspects of themselves, begins to believe they are special, enlightened, above others. Jung emerged from this experience transformed, but not unscathed. He knew that few could endure what he endured, and for this reason he began to warn about the dangers of blind exploration of the unconscious. Self-knowledge, he said, must be cultivated with humility and vigilance, because the unconscious is not a neutral territory. It is a living power with its own intentions, its own rhythms, and it does not tolerate arrogance. From this crossing, Jung formulated the basis of his analytical psychology, but more than theories, he left a testimony. Deep self-knowledge is a dangerous task. It can lead to integration, but also to fragmentation. It can generate wisdom or delusion. And what determines this outcome is not the depth of introspection, but the ability to keep one foot in reality while descending into the symbolic hell of the soul. However, there is an even more critical point in this journey. A moment where the ego, instead of dissolving, expands in a distorted way, creating an illusion of greatness and psychological power. In the next part, we will explore this phenomenon, ego inflation, and the emergence of an identity built from archetypes and ideas, but disconnected from real life. Because sometimes, the greatest danger of knowing too much is thinking that there is nothing more to learn. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. When Jung coined the term ego inflation, he was not referring to common vanity or exaggerated pride. He was talking about a much more subtle and dangerous phenomenon, the moment when the ego, upon coming into contact with deep contents of the unconscious, especially those of an archetypal nature, begins to identify with them. The individual ceases to be just a person trying to understand themselves and starts to believe they are a bearer of universal truths. They confuse symbolic experience with a spiritual mission, and at that moment, self-knowledge transforms into an illusion of grandeur. Imagine someone who dives deeply into their own psyche, discovers symbols, patterns, hidden messages, and begins to believe they have access to a type of knowledge reserved only for the awakened. This person, enchanted by their own inner journey, starts to speak as if they were an oracle. They use psychological terms to explain everything and everyone. They assume a posture of mentor or healer without having truly transformed internally. They have not integrated the contents of the unconscious. They have been seduced by them. And the most dangerous part, they do not realize it. For Jung, this state is as dangerous as the repression of the unconscious. The inflated ego begins to construct a persona based on archetypes: the wise one, the healer, the visionary, the martyr. But all of this is a facade. Behind the elevated image, there exists a fragile, insecure ego hungry for validation. Inflation is not strength, it is compensation. The individual has not become more conscious. They have merely replaced their old identity with a spiritualized fantasy. They no longer live, they perform. And the more they perform, the further they drift from their own soul. This phenomenon is common in people who study psychology, philosophy, or spirituality without practical grounding. They become skilled at naming internal processes, at symbolically explaining their pains, traumas, conflicts. But they lose the ability to feel them. They intellectualize everything, anesthetizing the raw experience of life with refined vocabulary. They create a psychological bubble where everything has a deep meaning, but nothing is truly lived. There is no surrender, only analysis. There is no transformation, only discourse. Jung observed this in his own patients, and also in himself. That is why he emphasized the importance of humility in the individuation journey. He knew that contact with the unconscious can inflate us with meanings, but that only concrete experience, real relationships, and everyday challenges can keep us anchored. Without this anchor, the individual floats in a world of symbols that no longer belong to life. And when this happens, they disconnect from others. Because ego inflation is not just an internal distortion, it is also an obstacle to empathy, dialogue, and coexistence. Those who feel superior do not listen. Those who believe they have access to hidden truths find it hard to sustain an honest conversation. Gradually, the person inflated by excessive self-knowledge becomes socially isolated. Not because they have been rejected, but because they no longer recognize value in simple human experiences. They think of themselves as beyond, but in reality, they are just alone. And it is precisely this loneliness that marks the next stage of inner collapse. The isolation of the modern hermit, a condition in which the individual, consumed by their own psychic universe, loses the ability to connect with the world around them. In the next segment, we will explore how excessive introspection can lead to emotional disconnection, loss of spontaneity, and, in extreme cases, the inability to live authentic relationships. Because the true danger lies not in knowing too much, but in no longer knowing how to love. The process of deep self-knowledge, when taken to the extreme, can lead the individual to a state of emotional and social isolation that Jung described with clinical precision. It is a loneliness that does not arise from external rejection, but from internal separation, a distancing from the world caused by excessive attention to one's own psychic universe. The subject disconnects not because the world has excluded them, but because they themselves voluntarily have ceased to inhabit it. Jung observed that many who dive into introspection end up developing what we can call pathological self-absorption, a kind of prison of mirrors where everything perceived revolves around the self. Every gesture, emotion, word, or relationship becomes material to be analyzed, interpreted, deciphered. Spontaneity becomes suspect. Chance is feared, and human interactions are experienced with a certain clinical detachment. Life loses its fluidity. Each encounter is an experiment, each emotion a symptom. This type of individual may even seem calm, centered, profound, but they are emotionally frozen. They live in a watchtower, observing themselves all the time, trying to control every impulse, every reaction, every thought. The search for balance turns into an obsession with stability. The fear of repeating unconscious patterns prevents them from living fully. And the more they try to protect themselves from themselves, the more they isolate from others. The problem is that this isolation is not experienced as immediate suffering. On the contrary, for many, it emerges as a conscious refuge, a space where they can finally be themselves, free from the chaos of the world. But over time, this refuge reveals itself to be a disguised prison. The absence of real relationships begins to silently corrode the soul. The lack of human contact, conflict, affection, and even banality makes existence sterile. The individual lives in a permanent state of observation, but no longer knows what it means to genuinely feel something. Jung understood that human beings do not realize themselves solely in introspection, but mainly in relationship. It is in the encounter with the other, with alterity, that the unconscious reveals itself, that complexes are activated, that the shadow appears, and that true growth occurs. A psyche that is not challenged by other psyches becomes narcissistic, not in the vulgar sense of the term, but in the clinical sense. The external world loses value, and everything revolves around one's own reflection. This isolation does not only affect the emotional field, it corrodes vitality. People who were once curious, creative, expressive become apathetic, disinterested, excessively rational. Life transforms into a process of maintaining consciousness, as if the goal were merely not to get lost and no longer to live. Jung warned that total consciousness is unbearable, and that human beings do need zones of shadow, mystery, and forgetfulness to remain healthy. The problem of the modern hermit is not silence, but sterility. But this process does not stop there. When isolation prolongs and the individual loses the ability to trust their own spontaneity, a new, even more insidious stage emerges: the paralysis of hyper-reflection, a state where every action is preceded by doubt, every emotion is suspect, and every internal movement is dissected even before being lived. In the next chapter, we will explore how excessive analysis can paralyze existence, transforming life into an endless psychological laboratory, where nothing is lived, everything is merely interpreted. Because when you think too much about living, you have already stopped living. At first glance, self-reflection seems like a sign of maturity. The ability for self-analysis is often seen as an evolutionary achievement of the mind, a trait that separates the human from the instinctual. But what happens when this reflection becomes excessive, compulsive, endless? Carl Jung observed that there is a point where analysis ceases to be a tool of awareness and becomes a form of defense against life itself. This is the territory of hyper-reflection, a state where the individual becomes an eternal observer of themselves, unable to act without first dissecting every motivation, emotion, or intention. People trapped in this state do not live, they monitor. Every impulse is analyzed until it loses its strength. Every desire is examined in light of the shadow, the archetype, the complex, and for that reason, it is deactivated. The subject transforms into a bureaucrat of their own psyche, organizing internal files with obsessive precision, but without leaving the control room. It is a form of psychological perfectionism, where nothing can be done until everything is understood. And, as the human soul is inexhaustible, that moment never arrives. This paralysis is not just mental. It affects the body, relationships, and life projects. The person thinks so much about what they should feel that they no longer feel. They question their intentions so much that they cannot make simple decisions. They evaluate their reactions so much that they no longer know if they are being authentic or just rehearsing an ideal response. Life becomes a minefield of possibilities, where each step is preceded by infinite internal simulations of what could happen. The fear is no longer of making mistakes, it is of acting. Jung believed that the psyche needs movement, flow, action. When it becomes static, rigid, turned only inward, it begins to devour itself. Thought feeds on thought. Analysis generates more analysis, and instead of liberating, it imprisons. Consciousness becomes a lit lamp in a locked room, always illuminating the same walls. There is no progress, no risk, no surprise, just rumination. This state can be paradoxically fueled by the very search for authenticity. The subject wants to act according to their true self, wants to make conscious choices, wants to avoid repeating patterns. But this legitimate desire to live with more clarity is hijacked by an unconscious perfectionism, which turns every step into an obligation to be deep, meaningful, archetypal. Life loses its freshness. The spontaneous becomes suspicious. The simple is devalued. The cruelest consequence of this hyper-reflection is the loss of self-confidence. Everything becomes a reason for doubt. Is this feeling true? Is this will from the ego or the self? Is this desire authentic or an unconscious compensation? And in this labyrinth of questions, the person distances themselves further from the direct experience of life. They feel hunger, but do not eat. They feel the urge to hug, but hesitate. They have ideas, but never execute them. The world transforms into an abstraction. Jung knew that the mind needs pause, forgetfulness, surrender. The soul, he said, does not just want to be understood, it wants to be lived, and for that, courage is necessary. Courage to err, to improvise, to act without knowing all the answers. Because it is in the act and not in the analysis that life truly transforms. And it is precisely at this point that he offers us one of his most valuable teachings, the importance of mystery, of that which cannot be fully understood. In the next chapter, we will explore Jung's wisdom in recognizing the limits of self-knowledge, and why preserving parts of oneself in silence can be, paradoxically, the deepest form of awareness. Because there is a part of the soul that only flourishes when we stop trying to explain it. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. In an era where everything needs to be named, understood, and explained, Carl Jung invites us to a radically opposite stance, to accept that there are dimensions of the soul that should not be fully unveiled. Instead of trying to illuminate every dark corner of the psyche, Jung proposes something almost heretical to modern thought: to cultivate mystery as an essential part of psychological health. He understood that human beings need shadow as much as they need light. That the unknown within us is not merely a residue of ignorance, but an active source of vitality, imagination, and transformation. Consciousness, as valuable as it is, has its limits. When we exceed those limits in an attempt to control every nuance of our psyche, we risk destroying what makes it alive, its enigmatic character. Jung realized that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed traumas, but also a reservoir of symbols, intuitions, and creative impulses that cannot, and should not, be completely tamed by reason. By trying to rationalize everything, the individual stifles their capacity to create, to love, to surrender to the unpredictability of existence. It is at this point that self-knowledge, instead of making us freer, begins to cage us. The person starts to live within a symbolic grid, where every act must have a profound meaning, every emotion must be traced back to its archetypal origin, and every relationship must be interpreted in light of psychodynamics. The mystery disappears, and with it, the fascination for life also vanishes. Jung warned, not everything in us should be exposed to the light of consciousness. Some aspects need to remain in the shadows to maintain their symbolic strength and their connection to the sacred. He saw this clearly in his own experiences with the unconscious. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he recounts that many of his most impactful dreams and visions could not, and should not, be explained in rational language. They were experiences that demanded respect, not dissection. The soul, he said, wants to be touched, not dissected. There is a deep intelligence in not wanting to understand everything, in allowing certain feelings, impulses, and dreams to remain as living enigmas within us, because it is in the space of the unknown that imagination breathes. It is in mystery that the soul finds its nourishment. When everything is interpreted, labeled and classified, there is little room left for wonder, for enchantment, for surprise. And a psyche without surprise is a dying psyche. Keeping parts of oneself in the dark is not regression. It is maturity. It is knowing that absolute control of the mind is a fantasy. That true psychic balance does not come from knowing everything about oneself, but from knowing enough to live with presence, integrity, and openness to the unexpected. Jung teaches us that the human soul is not an object to be dominated, but a sacred territory to be inhabited with reverence. But how to live this in practice? How to know when we are getting to know ourselves to live better, and when we are merely using self-knowledge as an escape from life? How to find the balance between consciousness and surrender, between analysis and spontaneity? In the next and final part, we will address this essential synthesis: self-knowledge as a tool, and not as an end. Jung's vision of the true goal of individuation: to live with awareness, but without losing the capacity to be surprised, to take risks, and to connect deeply with the world and with others. Because in the end, knowing oneself is just the beginning. The rest is life lived. At the end of his long journey as a psychiatrist, thinker, and seeker, Carl Gustav Jung came to a conclusion that contradicts much of modern obsession with introspection. Self-knowledge is not an end in itself. It is merely a tool. One of the most powerful, yes, but still a tool. A means to live better, not a substitute for life. This is the crucial point that many miss when they dive too deep into analysis, personality tests, archetypal maps, and family patterns. They believe the goal is to completely understand oneself, as if there were a finish line in the journey of consciousness. Jung shows us that there isn't. Knowing oneself is a stage, important, profound, demanding, but it only makes sense if it is followed by something even more challenging: living. Putting that knowledge to the service of reality, human relationships, creativity, love, pain, failure. Self-knowledge that does not lead to life becomes a gilded cage, an intellectual masturbation, a simulation of evolution. It produces people who know everything about their traumas but still do not know how to apologize, who understand their complexes but do not know how to listen without interrupting, who have memorized the names of their archetypes but have lost the ability to improvise, laugh, and make mistakes. True psychological maturity for Jung is not in knowing everything that inhabits your soul, but in living with integrity even in the face of what you do not yet understand. It is in being able to act even without certainty, in loving even without mastering all of your internal mechanisms, in being able to surrender to the present moment without needing to label it. Because in the end, wisdom is not measured by the quantity of concepts you accumulate, but by the depth of your commitment to reality. That is why Jung said that individuation, this process of becoming who you are, is not completed on the couch, nor in the pages of books. It manifests in the way you respond to life, in how you face loss, how you treat others when you are frustrated, how you deal with boredom, fear, desire, how you transform knowledge into action. This video was an invitation to deep reflection on the limits and dangers of self-knowledge, a warning for those who are using the inner journey as an excuse to avoid real life, but also a powerful affirmation. It is possible to find balance. It is possible to know yourself enough to live with more presence and still keep the mystery alive, to maintain space for doubt, for the sacred, for the spontaneous, because deep down, that is what keeps us human. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were getting lost in so much self-analysis? Have you gone through a moment when you felt you knew too much about yourself, yet still couldn't act? Comment below. Your experience can help others who are also facing this dilemma. And if this video impacted you, brought you clarity, or even bothered you, great. That means you are on the right path. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with those you know need to hear this. And keep watching the next video. It is important, perhaps more than you imagine.